Before we descend into the labyrinth that lies beneath the surface, into a world of shadow warfare and high-stakes espionage, please make sure to subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an investigation into the operations that shape our geopolitical reality. These are the stories the news cycle misses, the silent battles fought in the dark. The surface of Gaza is a known quantity. It is mapped by satellites, monitored by drones, and studied by analysts in air-conditioned rooms in Tel Aviv. But beneath the asphalt and the sand, there exists a second city, a metropolis of concrete and darkness that intelligence agencies call the Metro. For years, the assumption was that this network was crude, a series of smuggling burrows dug by hand. But in the early 2020s, a new reality began to dawn on the planners at the Kiryat, Israel's defense headquarters. The enemy had evolved. They were no longer building tunnels. They were building an underground fortress. This was not a collection of dirt paths, but a sophisticated, reinforced grid of command centers, weapon depots, and sleeping quarters, all connected by a hardwired communication system that was completely invisible to the electronic eavesdropping that Israel had relied on for decades. The network was designed to be unbreakable. It was deep, up to 60 meters in some sectors, encased in reinforced concrete that could withstand standard aerial bombardment, and crucially, it was offline. The man responsible for this architectural evolution was known in intelligence circles only as the engineer. He was a phantom, a figure who understood that in the age of ubiquitous surveillance, the only safety lay in the analog. He designed a system where orders were passed through copper wires, not cell phone signals, where ventilation was passive to avoid thermal signatures, where the entrances were located inside private homes, masked by the mundane rhythms of daily life. For Mossad and the Shin Bet, this presented a tactical nightmare. The old doctrine of see and strike was obsolete because they could no longer see. The tunnels were a black hole. Assets went in, and they disappeared from the radar. Weapons were moved without a single pixel changing on a satellite feed. The strategic balance was shifting. The enemy had built a sanctuary that rendered Israel's technological superiority irrelevant. The realization hit during a debriefing of a low-level asset who had managed to flee the territory. He spoke not of dirt tunnels, but of tiled floors, of air conditioning units that vented into sewage systems to hide the heat, and of a fiber optic network that allowed commanders to speak to one another across the entire strip without ever transmitting a radio wave. The asset described the confidence of the operatives underground. They felt untouchable. They called it the Iron Web. In Tel Aviv, the mood was grim. The challenge wasn't just to destroy a tunnel, it was to penetrate a mindset. To defeat the Iron Web, Mossad would have to stop looking at the ground as a physical barrier and start treating it as a complex puzzle. They needed a way to turn the enemy's greatest strength, their reliance on this secure, isolated network, into their ultimate vulnerability. The decision was made at the highest levels. If we cannot destroy the network from above, we must infect it from within. We must make the dark places transparent. Operation Silent Earth was born. The first problem was detection. You cannot trap an enemy you cannot locate. Traditional ground-penetrating radar had limits. The soil composition in the region was dense, cluttered with decades of metallic debris and urban infrastructure. The engineer had used this to his advantage, digging beneath the water table in some areas. Knowing that water absorbs and scatters radar waves, the tunnels were invisible to the eyes in the sky. Mossad's technological division, a unit that operates in the windowless basements of Herzliya, proposed a radical solution. If they couldn't see the tunnels, they would have to listen for them, but not with standard microphones. The goal was to map the void. Every underground structure, no matter how silent, disrupts the natural resonance of the earth. When a heavy truck drives over a solid road, the vibration travels differently than when it drives over a hollow cavity. The plan required planting a new generation of seismic sensors, devices no larger than a coin, along the perimeter and, crucially, inside the territory itself. These sensors, codenamed geophones, were designed to pick up the negative space. They weren't listening for digging. The digging was finished. They were listening for the absence of Earth. Inserting these devices was a logistical puzzle. The border was a kill zone. monitored by cameras and automated systems on both sides. A human insertion was too risky. The likelihood of compromise was near 100%. The solution came from an unexpected source: ornithology. The region was a major migration path for birds moving between Europe and Africa. The technological unit disguised the sensors as environmental debris: rocks, pieces of discarded plastic, even synthetic bird droppings. These were deployed not by soldiers, but by modified commercial drones that flew flight paths, mimicking the erratic patterns of migratory flocks. Over a period of 3 months, thousands of these microsensors were dropped into the open fields and urban outskirts of the territory. Once on the ground, the sensors formed a passive mesh network. They lay dormant, waking up only when triggered by specific vibrational frequencies. Heavy vehicles, the rhythmic thrum of a generator, or the distinct footfall of groups of men moving in unison underground. The data they collected was fragmentary, mere whispers in the noise of a busy city. But back in Tel Aviv, a supercomputer named the Weaver began to stitch these whispers together. It filtered out the noise of surface traffic, the wind, the ocean. It looked for the anomalies. It searched for the straight lines where the Earth didn't vibrate correctly. Slowly, painfully, a map began to emerge on the screens of the analysts. It was faint, like a ghost image, but it was undeniable. The map revealed a lattice of corridors that defied previous intelligence estimates. The network wasn't just defensive, it was offensive. There were arteries leading toward the border, waiting to be opened. There were massive subterranean halls that could only be assembly points. But the most alarming discovery was the silence. There were sectors of the map where the sensors picked up nothing, absolutely nothing. These were the deep command bunkers, insulated so well that they swallowed all sound. The Weaver identified these silent zones as the brain of the operation. The engineer was down there, in the quiet, moving pieces on a chessboard that he thought no one else could see. But Mossad had found the board. Now, they had to figure out how to play the game without letting the opponent know the board was lit up. The acoustic map was the first step, but it wasn't enough. Knowing where the tunnel is doesn't tell you what is happening inside it. For that, they needed to tap into the nervous system of the iron web. They needed access to the wires. The iron web relied on hard lines, copper and fiber optics. This was its security, but also its logistical Achilles heel. You cannot dig a tunnel and wire a command center with materials found in a grocery store. You need industrial-grade routers, miles of specific cabling, repeaters, and ventilation scrubbers. And Gaza, for all its isolation, still relied on the importation of goods. The engineer was meticulous. He used shell companies, middlemen, and a labyrinth of commercial fronts to import dual-use technology. A shipment of medical equipment might contain high-grade fiber optic cables hidden in the casing. A delivery of agricultural pumps might house ventilation turbines. He believed his supply chain was opaque, buried under layers of bureaucracy and corruption at the ports. Mossad's economic warfare division, Harpoon, began to dismantle the ledger. They didn't want to stop the shipments. Stopping the shipments would alert the engineer that his methods were compromised. Instead, they wanted to own the shipments. The objective was supply chain interdiction, but with a twist. They termed it the Trojan Horse Protocol. The target was a shipment of industrial routers ostensibly bound for a telecommunications provider in the coastal enclave. Intelligence indicated these weren't for civilian Wi-Fi. Their specifications matched the hardened requirements of a subterranean communication grid. The shipment originated in East Asia, transited through a port in southern Europe, and was scheduled for overland transport. Operatives intercepted the container in Europe. They had a window of 6 hours while the cargo sat in a customs holding warehouse. A specialized technical team, flown in on a private charter, breached the container without breaking the seals, a technique involving removing the hinge pins of the doors rather than cutting the lock. Inside, they found the routers. They didn't plant listening devices. Those are too easy to detect with electronic sweepers. Instead, they replaced the firmware chips on the circuit boards. The new chips were identical to the naked eye, indistinguishable even under a standard microscope, but they contained a sleepwalker code. This code was designed to be passive. It would not beacon out. It would not transmit data wirelessly. That would be suicide in a secure tunnel. Instead, the code acted as a passive recorder, logging the data packets that flowed through the router, voice commands, inventory lists, deployment schedules. It compressed this data into microscopic bursts. But how to get the data out of a hardwired offline tunnel? The Harpoon team had anticipated this. The firmware was designed to wait for a specific handshake. It turned the router into a localized receiver. It could not transmit long distances, but if a device with the correct key came within 10 meters, even through several meters of concrete, it would dump its memory in a microsecond burst. The container was resealed. The shipment continued its journey. Mossad watched as the routers crossed the border, passed through the hands of the telecommunications company, and vanished into the back of a nondescript van. The tracking stopped there. The hardware had gone underground. The engineer installed the routers. He ran his diagnostics. He swept for bugs. He found nothing. The system appeared secure. He began to route his most sensitive communications through the new hardware, believing he was speaking in a soundproof room. In reality, he was speaking into a tape recorder that Mossad had placed on his desk, waiting for someone to come and collect the tape. The paradox of the secure network was complete. By relying on specific high-tech hardware to remain offline, he had created a physical dependency that could be physically compromised. Technology is a force multiplier, but espionage is fundamentally a human discipline. The sensors and the corrupted routers provided the where and the how, but they lacked the who and the when. To truly outsmart the system, Mossad needed a pair of eyes inside the metro. They needed a defector in place. Recruiting in the enclave was notoriously difficult. The internal security apparatus was ruthless. Suspicion alone was often a death sentence. But the engineers' expansion of the tunnel network had created a vulnerability: the workforce. The sheer scale of the construction required contractors, electricians, and concrete specialists who were not part of the inner ideological circle. They were hired hands, compartmentalized, blindfolded during transit, but essential to the project. The target was a man we will call Karim. Karim was a structural engineer, not a fighter. He was responsible for the integrity of the deep bunkers, ensuring the ventilation shafts didn't collapse under the pressure of the sand. He was a man of science, not ideology, and he was a man with a sick daughter who required treatment that was unavailable in the local hospitals. Mossad's recruiters, the Qatsis, didn't approach him in a dark alley. They approached him in the digital space, posing as a European medical charity specializing in pediatric care. They offered help. They arranged for a consultation. They built a relationship based on gratitude and humanity, not politics. The pivot came months later. The charity worker, actually an intelligence officer, revealed that to get the daughter the specific genetic therapy she needed, they required travel permits and funding that only certain friends could facilitate. Karim understood immediately. He was not asked to plant a bomb or assassinate a leader. He was asked for information. "Just tell us if the concrete pours are shifting," they said. "Tell us where the stress fractures are." It seemed innocuous. But for the analysts in Tel Aviv, knowing where the concrete was being poured was the final piece of the puzzle. It confirmed the depth and the thickness of the command centers. Karim became a human sensor. One day, Karim was asked to do something more dangerous. He was given a small device disguised as a voltage meter, a standard tool for his job. He was told to use it to test the electrical outlets in the command sector during his maintenance rounds. In reality, this device was the key to the routers. When Karim plugged it in to check the voltage, it sent the handshake signal through the electrical wiring of the bunker, which ran parallel to the data cables. The corrupted routers picked up the signal. They dumped their encrypted logs into the power grid, modulating the frequency of the electricity itself. The voltage meter recorded the fluctuations. In 10 seconds, Karim downloaded weeks of command-level communications onto a tool that looked like it cost $20 at a hardware store. He walked out of the tunnel, went home, and handed the device to a courier, an old woman who sold vegetables near the border crossing. She passed it to a relative with a permit, who passed it to a bus driver. The chain of custody was long and fragile, but it held. When the data finally reached the technicians, they didn't just see the map. They heard the voices. They heard the engineer discussing the rotation of guards. They heard the protocols for a specific emergency drill. They heard the fear that perhaps, just perhaps, the walls weren't thick enough. With the map, the communications, and the structural blueprints in hand, the temptation to strike was overwhelming. The Air Force could have launched bunker-busting munitions within the hour, but the director of Mossad held back. "If we strike now," he argued during a cabinet briefing, "we cut the head off a lizard. It grows back. We need to trap the entire body." The goal shifted from destruction to entrapment. They needed to convince the enemy that the tunnels were the safest place to be. They needed to reinforce the engineers' delusion of invincibility. This required a campaign of deception, a psyop of massive scale. Israel began to leak false intelligence. They allowed low-level communications to be intercepted, channels they knew the enemy monitored. In these channels, Israeli commanders complained about their blindness. They lamented that the new tunnels were impenetrable, that the underground network had successfully negated their intelligence capabilities. "We are deaf down there," one-stage transmission read. Simultaneously, the Air Force conducted strikes that were deliberately superficial. They would bomb an empty field or a shallow tunnel entrance, making a lot of noise but causing no strategic damage. This reinforced the narrative. Israel doesn't know where the real assets are. They are lashing out blindly. The engineer took the bait. The intercepted audio from the routers confirmed it. "They are confused," he was heard saying to a subordinate. "The iron web is holding." Emboldened, he began to move more high-value assets underground. Rocket stockpiles that had been dispersed in civilian areas were concentrated in the deep bunkers for safekeeping. Senior commanders who rarely slept in the same place began to use the command hub for joint planning sessions. The deception went further. Mossad utilized Karim, the structural engineer, to feed disinformation back into the system. Karim told his superiors that he had seen evidence of Israeli seismic probes failing. He produced falsified reports showing that the soil density was scrambling the sensors. The enemy leadership felt a surge of confidence. They believed they had achieved strategic surprise. This was the honeypot strategy applied to trench warfare. Mossad made the underground network feel like a warm, secure blanket. In reality, it was becoming a coffin. The more they concentrated their forces underground, the more efficient the eventual neutralization would be. The Weaver computer system was now tracking the movement of specific individuals based on the unique electronic signatures of their personal equipment, which the routers were dutifully logging. The analysts watched the screen. The red dots representing key commanders were slowly converging on Sector 4, the central hub. The trap was set, but to spring it, Mossad needed to trigger a specific event. They needed to force a full lockdown protocol. The intelligence collected by the corrupted routers revealed a standard operating procedure known as Protocol Black. In the event of a suspected ground incursion, the tunnel network was designed to seal itself. Blast doors would close, ventilation would switch to internal recycling, and all leadership would retreat to the deepest level of the metro to wait out the storm. This was intended to protect them. Mossad planned to use it to entomb them. The plan was to stage a feint, a limited ground maneuver that looked like the start of a major invasion. It had to be convincing enough to trigger Protocol Black, but controlled enough to avoid a full-scale war before the trap was sprung. It began on a moonless night. Specialized IDF units moved toward the border fence, accompanied by heavy armor. They breached the perimeter in 3 specific locations, using engineering vehicles to clear paths. They didn't advance deep, they just crossed the line and held position, creating a massive acoustic and thermal signature. Simultaneously, cyber units launched a denial-of-service attack on the surface-level civilian communication networks. Cell towers went dark. The internet slowed to a crawl. This forced the enemy commanders to switch entirely to their hardwired tunnel network, the very network Mossad owned. Down in the metro, the alarms rang. The engineer saw the troop movements, the communications blackout, and the armor breaching the fence. To him, this was the invasion he had prepared for. He issued the order, "Initiate Protocol Black." The blast doors slammed shut. The commanders, the logistics experts, and the engineer himself moved to the central command bunker, deep below the surface. They locked themselves in, believing they were secure from the chaos above. They verified the seals. They checked the air scrubbers. They sat around the conference table waiting for reports from the surface. What they didn't know was that Karim had done one last job before fleeing the territory 2 days earlier. He had tampered with the hydraulic control systems of the main blast doors in Sector 4. They weren't just locked, they were jammed. The mechanism to reopen them from the inside had been disabled. And then, the routers did something they had never done before. They stopped being passive. On a command from Tel Aviv, the corrupted firmware woke up and flooded the internal network with gibberish code. The screens in the command bunker went blue. The communication lines went dead. The lights flickered and died as the power management software, also routed through the compromised hardware, crashed. The Unbreakable network had just become a prison. They were 60 meters down, in the dark, with no way to talk to the surface, and the doors wouldn't open. Above ground, the Israeli tanks' engines idled, then reversed. They withdrew back across the border. There was no invasion. There was only silence. The psychological impact of silence in a subterranean environment cannot be overstated. For the men trapped in the central hub, the first hour was likely spent in disciplined troubleshooting. They were professionals. They assumed it was a technical glitch or a temporary power outage caused by the surface bombardment they imagined was happening. But as the hours ticked by, the reality set in. There were no explosions vibrating through the walls. The seismic sensors in the bunker, their own sensors, showed no heavy armor moving above them. The air grew stale. The ventilation system, which relied on the now crashed network to regulate airflow based on oxygen levels, had defaulted to its safe mode, which meant minimum capacity. In Tel Aviv, the operation shifted to the containment phase. Mossad didn't need to fire a shot. They had effectively decapitated the organization without dropping a single bomb. The leadership was trapped in a box of their own making. The Weaver computer continued to monitor the passive signals. It picked up the desperate attempts to reboot the system. It recorded the spikes in voice volume as panic set in. The iron web had turned into an echo chamber. Without orders from the central hub, the cells on the surface and in other tunnel sectors were paralyzed. They followed their standing orders, wait for instructions. But no instructions came. The rocket squads didn't fire because they didn't receive the launch coordinates. The ambush team stayed in their positions until they ran out of water. The centralized command structure, which the engineer had built to ensure absolute control, became the mechanism of absolute failure. This was the brilliance of the operation. By centralizing the network, the engineer had created a single point of failure. Mossad hadn't attacked the limbs. They had induced a stroke in the brain. Days passed. The situation underground became critical. The psychological pressure of the unknown broke the cohesion of the group. Without a visible enemy to fight, they turned on each other. Accusations of betrayal echoed off the concrete walls. How did the system fail? Who compromised the grid? Eventually, the oxygen levels dropped low enough to induce lethargy. The shouting stopped. The frantic work on the blast door hydraulics ceased. The command bunker became a tomb of exhausted, confused men who realized, too late, that their technological fortress was a trap. Mossad signaled the end of the operation by sending a single message to the one functioning screen in the bunker. A backup monitor connected to the emergency power. The screen lit up with a single line of text in Arabic. "The Earth has eyes." Then, the power was cut remotely for good. With the leadership neutralized underground, the dismantling of the surface infrastructure began. It was surgical. Intelligence provided by the initial mapping and the communications intercepts allowed the IDF to target specific logistical nodes that supported the tunnel network. Cement mixers were interdicted. Warehouses storing ventilation parts were raided or destroyed with precision strikes. The entrances to the tunnels, hidden in homes and mosques, were exposed. But instead of bombing them, Israel used a new technique: the sponge. Combat engineers pumped a specialized expanding foam into the shafts. This wasn't explosive. It was a rapid hardening polymer that expanded to 30 times its volume. It filled the corridors, the weapon depots, and the sleeping quarters. It hardened into a substance tougher than concrete. The tunnels weren't just blocked, they were erased. The equipment inside was encased in polymer. The weapons were rendered useless. The metro was fossilized. The operatives remaining in the secondary tunnels found themselves walled in. They tried to retreat, only to find their escape routes filled with the gray, impenetrable foam. They were forced to surface, emerging from their hidden holes right into the waiting arms of security forces who knew exactly where they would pop up. The arrests were quiet. There were no major gun battles. The enemy was demoralized. They had lost their commanders, their communications, and their sanctuary. The myth of the Unbreakable network shattered. The public in Gaza watched in confusion. There was no great battle, yet the resistance seemed to evaporate. The rockets didn't fly. The fiery speeches from the leadership stopped. Rumors began to circulate that the leaders had fled, or that they had made a secret deal. The truth, that they were sitting in the dark beneath the people's feet, was far more damaging to their reputation than martyrdom in battle. Following the neutralization of the central hub, Mossad faced a new challenge: exploitation. The network was dead, but the data inside it was a goldmine. The corrupted routers held terabytes of historical data, blueprints, financial ledgers, identities of foreign backers, and plans for future operations. A specialized team was assembled to physically breach the sealed bunker. They drilled through the reinforced concrete using silent, diamond-tipped boreholes. They didn't enter, they lowered probes. They connected directly to the mainframe of the crashed server. The data extraction, Operation Recall, was the largest intelligence haul in the history of the conflict. It laid bare the entire financial architecture of the organization. It exposed the bank accounts in Europe, the shell companies in South America, and the couriers in the Gulf. This intelligence was weaponized immediately. Accounts were frozen, front companies were sanctioned. Operatives in foreign countries were arrested by local services acting on Mossad tips. The organization wasn't just defeated in Gaza, it was dismantled globally. The engineer's legacy became the roadmap for his organization's destruction. Every protocol he had written, every contingency plan he had saved, was used to predict and counter the fragmented remnants of his group. The final insult to the engineer's work was the repurposing of the tunnels. In the sectors that hadn't been filled with foam, Israel installed their own sensors, permanent ones this time. The metro became a listening post for Israel. The enemy had dug the tunnels, reinforced them, and paid for them, only to have them turned into the largest Israeli surveillance device in the territory. The impact of Operation Silent Earth extended beyond the physical destruction of the tunnels. It caused a psychological collapse within the ranks of the adversary. The fear of the mole became paranoid. If the secure network was compromised, what could be trusted? Commanders refused to use electronic devices. They went back to paper runners, which were slow and inefficient. They stopped trusting their own engineers. Internal purges began as the organization tried to find the traitors who had sold them out. They blamed the concrete suppliers, the electricians, even the cooks. This paranoia paralyzed them. An organization consumed by internal suspicion cannot fight an external war effectively. Recruitment dried up. Young men were afraid to join a group where they might be accused of being a spy simply because a light bulb flickered. The legend of the Unbreakable tunnel became a cautionary tale. It demonstrated that in the modern age, static defenses are death traps. The more you wall yourself in, the easier it is for a smart enemy to lock the door. Israel's strategic messaging capitalized on this. They released selected declassified satellite images showing the sponge filling the tunnels. They leaked audio of the confused commanders during the lockdown. They stripped away the mystique of the metro. It wasn't a fortress, it was a cage. In the aftermath, military academies around the world studied Operation Silent Earth. It rewrote the book on counter-subterranean warfare. It proved that the solution to underground threats wasn't necessarily more powerful bombs, but smarter integration of cyber warfare, supply chain interdiction, and psychological operations. Mossad established a new permanent division dedicated to subsurface intelligence. They recognized that the underground domain was the new frontier. Future wars would be fought in megacities with vast subway systems, sewers, and utility tunnels. The lessons learned in Gaza were applicable globally. The operation also marked a shift in Israeli doctrine from deterrence to systemic neutralization. Deterrence relies on the enemy fearing the cost of action. Neutralization removes the capacity for action entirely. The ultimate success of the operation was its silence. The world barely noticed. There were no CNN breaking news banners about a massive invasion. There were no UN resolutions condemning the destruction of a city. The war was fought and won in the dark, leaving the surface relatively untouched. Years later, the entry points to the metro are overgrown with weeds. The concrete beneath the earth is silent, filled with hardened foam or sealed by rusted blast doors. The city above bustles with life, largely unaware of the silent drama that played out beneath its foundations. The engineer is gone, a ghost in a machine that ceased to function. His masterpiece, the Iron Web, is a relic of a failed strategy. Mossad's victory was absolute because it was invisible. They didn't conquer the territory. They conquered the space where the enemy felt most secure. They proved that there is no such thing as an unbreakable network, only a puzzle waiting for the right mind to solve it. The story of the tunnels is a reminder that in the shadow war, the greatest weapon is not the missile or the tank. It is the ability to understand the enemy's mind better than he understands it himself, to see the flaw in his perfection, to turn his sanctuary into his cell. As we conclude this investigation, ask yourself, what other invisible networks are operating beneath our feet right now? And who is listening to the silence? If you found this deep dive into the architecture of espionage fascinating, please hit the like button. It helps these stories reach the surface. Share this video with someone who thinks they understand modern warfare. And don't forget to subscribe. The next file is already being declassified. Stay curious.